Hello folks, welcome to this new topic of Soviet culture. You'll see that it spans across the Lenin period and into the Stalin period, and it's a really good one to be able to tie the two leaders together. And also we'll be doing quite a wee bit of compare and contrast. This will tie up nicely the consolidation of Lenin's power, and it'll lead us nicely into what Stalin does in Russia. So let's get started. I'd like to think that by this time you've already read the first 10 pages. That's chapter 1 in the new book that we've attached onto the Google Classroom, and also chapter 6, which is all about Stalin's Russia. And certainly that should be the background for this presentation. You'll find it useful to pause the presentation and make notes on the slides, and there might be bits and pieces from the textbook that you want to add to your notes, but this will certainly be the framework from which you can get started. So let's go. This is indeed the basis of it all, this idea of socialist realism, and that's a really important term. Essentially, Lenin and Stalin sought to create reality in Russia was now socialist, and he was going to use, or both of them were going to use, Soviet culture to be able to do that. Lenin himself says that the purpose of art and literature is to serve the people, and they saw that this would be a policy that would direct the people like any other, like an economic policy, like agriculture, like the land issues or the industry. This was something that was just crucial to allowing socialism to develop in Russia. It all had to conform, however, to the leaders' standards, and that's something we can't get away from. So you'll see that in part of this culture, usually writers, authors are key to it all, and Lenin and Stalin saw them as what they've called engineers of the human soul. Remember, they're trying to create a socialist reality through that idea of socialist realism. Stalin did not believe in freedom of expression. Instead, he wanted to make literature a useful product for the state. And so all work in literature had to be acceptable by the state, understandable by the people, socialist in nature, optimistic and uplifting, so that people would feel a real positivity about this new method of government. Not everybody wanted to create work like that, however, and if you didn't, there were consequences for you. You could have been sent to the gulag. You've heard of the concentration camps in Germany. Well, the gulag were the forerunners of these work camps, really hard, difficult places. I know some of you may have come across them on the Call of Duty game, but the gulag is actually a thing in history, and it started off here in Russia. You would have lost your position. Maybe you were a writer, an author, also maybe a teacher or a professor. Well, if your work didn't live up to Soviet expectation, you lost your position in the world of academia. You lost your liberty. You might have been put in a prison, or indeed the gulag, like we said. You may have lost your life. Maybe you lost your life because you couldn't live with this kind of restriction anymore. Maybe you were arrested, imprisoned. You were maybe thrown out of this Soviet Union of writers, and without that, you couldn't publish. A bit like the editor's law in Germany. If you didn't adhere to that, you couldn't publish. And like it here in Russia, similarly, so you had to sign up to this. And Robert Service, the great historian at this period, says more great intellectuals perished than survived. And so that's really important when we look at it. So moving on then to look at other areas of culture, we see painting, sculpture, filmmaking, opera, ballet, music, all examples. Well, like Hitler, Stalin condemns jazz. Many pieces were censured, and essentially the detail was that your duty was to serve Stalin and socialism. And if they believed your music or your ballet or your painting didn't do that, well, then you weren't able to produce your works. Music was more abstract, so harder to police, but Stalin thought himself an expert. Who does he sound like, I wonder? And he said he could recognize socialist music when he heard it, and he knew the kind of music that would inspire the people. And so you had to be producing stuff that he approved of. Hopefully you've been stopping and making your notes up to now. If not, let's rewind and do that, or let's move forward. So some creators of literature, of art, of music managed to survive. And why is that? Well, some survive, some make it in this socialist Russia because, well, they conform, they do what they're told. And the example of that is Gorky. Some have an international following, and that allows them to continue to work. And I suppose if you're really popular, particularly internationally, the Soviets are going to find it harder to persecute you. And you'll remember that maybe a bit like Clemens von Galen in Germany. Well, the same sort of thing happens here in Russia. You may just go back to not being creative, but just now go back to translating historical pieces, and Pasternak survives that way. Sometimes folk exposed others to further their own career, maybe told on folk to the secret police so that they wouldn't come under the radar, or they could slip under the radar and wouldn't put their head above the parapet. And I suppose that's one of the more sinister ways of being able to survive. But ultimately, we're trying to think, what is the purpose of culture under Stalin? And indeed, what was it under Lenin? Well, it's, remember, to create this reality of socialism, that people don't even question it anymore, that it just becomes a given, and that people win support for communism, for socialism, that folks start to love the leader, and that they can see communism as a real positive. So a cult of personality is set up, just like Hitler, when he said a cult of personality is the best form of government. Stalin wants to dominate all aspects of life. Soviet communism becomes known as Stalinism. Now, he doesn't seek it out because he's a quieter sort of a man. He's definitely not the big speaker that Hitler was, but when it happens, he doesn't prevent it. And we see here that Khrushchev, who will follow Stalin, the irony is that post-Stalin, he begins the policy of de-Stalinization. You'll maybe remember that from GCSE. But in his glory days, he needed to survive under Stalin's system. And so he is the first man to coin this term Stalinism in 1936. He's trying to win over Stalin's favor by coining this. And you'll have thought socialism, Marxism, Leninism. He coined Stalinism. And was promoting Stalin indeed. But remember, it's whatever people will do to survive in this. And the fact that after Stalin's dead, he de-Stalinizes Russia doesn't count at this time in history. So propaganda is going to be a means by which the cult of personality is fueled. Newspapers, cinemas, radio, schools, industry. We see the Stakhanovite movement, which is pushed forward as a propaganda, where this fellow was involved industrially. He was said to be a really unbelievable worker, producing so many times more of his daily quota than others. And so he found himself here in the beginning of the Time magazine. But that was all put forward. Look what you can do in Stalin's Russia. You could be as good as Stakhanov. And then also they're using, the church would have shown Stalin as an icon, you know, almost like a god. And so all of this was fueling the cult of personality. The Great Russia. This is perhaps my favourite bit in the whole section. And we see that, you know, Shakespeare was a Russian. In fact, when we come to look at it, we hear that America was first discovered by the Russians. And the atom was, of course, discovered by a Russian scientist. And you can find all of that when you come to look in the second chapter, chapter 6 in the new book that we've put up for you. So ultimately, they will tell Russians what Russians want to hear. Maybe nowadays our closest example of that is North Korea, where the North Koreans are fed propaganda that really just is different to the news that we know in the West. Stalin's birthday then becomes the biggest event in the social calendar, and you can see that It's celebrated all over Russia. You'll see that as we look to page 110. And then also the youth movement, Komsomol, a bit like Hitler Youth. It's exploited as a tool of the party. They train up party supporters from the young. They become the flag wavers, the cheerleaders, and it's all sycophantic, everybody sucking up to Stalin and saying how wonderful he is. Being in it brought privilege, probably got you to a better school, got you privilege for your family, and it grows to a membership of 10 million by 1940. The paradox is, and you'll have noticed this, that the communist movement draws its authority from the will of the masses. But it is so dependent on the idea of the great leader. And many of you questioned this earlier. Mrs. Carlyle's socialist, it's supposed to be everybody equal. So where does the leader fit in? And obviously he's the most equal among them all. And, he's there to draw everybody else towards the state of utopia, the state of Marxist idealism. But until they get there, they have to depend on the leader to help them towards the utopia. And that's something that they consider in the chapter. So was he popular with all of this cult of personality and all these books and paintings that he was allowing to kind of pull people towards his view? Was he actually popular? And some people suggest, well, he was, but it might have been out of duty or fear. Maybe only some people had an affection for him. Others suggest that he recognized he wasn't all that good at public speaking. Unlike Hitler, unlike Lenin on his soapbox, he maybe wasn't all that good at it. And so perhaps he limited his opportunity to put himself forward in the public domain. And that maybe allowed him to appear mysterious. And the mystery nearly added more to the cult of personality. The mystery of this man who's almost like a god. Not everybody gets to see or hear him. And that may have added to the idea that, well, if anything bad was going on in Russia, certainly wasn't Stalin's fault, and maybe that added to the opportunity for him to become popular. And actually, people came very grateful to him, particularly after the war. Under his watch, Russia won the first war that they had won in a long time. You'll remember that they definitely could not be said to have won the First World War, and they'd lost the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-05, and so this allowed him maybe an element of popularity. Also, education changes under these two leaders, and Lenin himself in the early years attacked book learning, got rid of exams. Instead, he wanted the people of Russia to be skilled, to be craftsmen, to learn trades, to be apprenticed. Now, Stalin changes all of this and brings back formal examination, saying that literacy was important, that qualifications were important, and indeed the self-discipline that's required to study and to learn and to become independent in that was something that was going to be needed for a structured, successful life in industry. And so he really focused on education. And we'll see that literacy goes up. 88% are literate by 1940. There's universal schooling. Everybody can go. It's not that you have to pay for it. Attendance is up. And so all of these are really positive. And he's going to use that in his propaganda to allow people to think well of him. But is it equal? Well, it's not. If you want to stay on to the end of your educational experience, you have to pay for it in the last 3 years. There is selection, and I'm sure some of you are thinking, how can that be, Mrs. Carlyle, in a place where there's supposed to be equality for all? It's socialist. But there was selection, not by social class, because that wouldn't be communist, indeed, but it was by ability. And some of you will still struggle with that against the political model, but that was how it was. There was some private tuition as well for the Soviet elite, maybe the high folks in the party, and so that allowed their children then to have a foothold in privileged positions in society. It allowed them to move on in ways that other children wouldn't be able to do. So I'm going to pause the video here, I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to allow you to transfer to the other video, and this is where we'll start. Just make sure your notes are up to date up until this bit, please.